Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Hunt. I'm a metal sculptor, and it'd be great to have you come on in and take a look and see what I've done.
Hello everyone, my name is Ron Billingsley. I'm a former CU English professor, and it's been my privilege to deal with literary art, but also in the recent years I've had a chance to look at the sculptural works of my friend and neighbor David Hunt. And today we're going to look closely at some of his work and have the privilege of having him tell us a little bit about his background, his development, and specifically the ideas and processes that he engendered in his life that enabled him to produce what I think you will all agree are very powerful, very beautiful sculptural pieces. Without any further ado, let me turn to Mr. Hunt and let him introduce himself briefly.
I'm also very fortunate to have a neighbor down the street that we can spend time with pontificating on various subjects. Ron Billingsley has not only been a good friend, but also a source of enlightenment for me, particularly when I get some pushback on some of my pet theories. And so I'm very, very thankful that he takes place with this presentation, and I'm hopefully that this is something that will be enjoyable to the audience.
One of the things that we're going to be able to do today is look at specific works and have Dave tell us what was the conception, what was the generating power and ideas behind that. What I would like for him to do initially is just talk for a few moments about how he moved from being a craftsman, a person who was trained in welding and with an engineering background, moved from that kind of training and that kind of foundation into a realm of experience and creativity where he could be a sculptor.
When I went back and spent a little time thinking about what I was going to say, I realized that there were three influences, Ron, that were interesting to me. One was the DNA in all of my writing on my family, particularly my Quaker grandfathers. Another one was Santa Claus, and a third one was my mom, and
and we can see this in your work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of the things about the DNA is that my third, fourth, and fifth Quaker grandfathers were millwrights, and this is starting in the 1700s forward, and then my great grandfather Samuel was a blacksmith. So what I'm hoping is that some of it resonated through the DNA from these particular people. Santa Claus was very helpful to me in 3 different Christmases with what he delivered under the Christmas tree. One of them was a set of Lincoln Logs. Another one was Tinker Toys, and and the third was an erector set, which I still have, and I just finished an elevator not too long ago. It's sitting in our dining room.
So your sculpture started very early.
It started from the craft side of the equation. It started real early, yeah. And then the other thing that was positive is that since my dad had died when I was 4, Mom farmed me out after the 6th grade in grade school, and so I got to work with a whole series of different farmers in crafting different things, fixing various implements, and driving Caterpillar tractors and so on. Then I had the good fortune of moving on into the Navy. And you and I have talked at length about our Navy experiences. But I got a whole year of electronics training in the Navy, which helped me out, really helped me later in my career as I moved into electrical engineering.
Oh, this is fascinating, and it will be fun, I think, for all of us to go have a look at some of your work. We've got 13 or 14 pieces here that we're going to be talking about. I found that particularly interesting that when you talk about your work, you're usually mentioning several different dimensions, several different aspects of your experience in creating the work. Let's take a look at your piece, which is called Celebration, which I love the title of the piece, and I love the feeling that I get when I look at the piece. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what went through your thinking as you were creating this celebration piece. What accounts for what we're looking at, if you will?
One of the underlying things of celebration is my my love of nature and particularly Mother Earth. And so when we're out in the open, or even a Olympic runner or a general runner, when they finish over the finish line, throwing their arms up and celebrating. And so that was sort of the underlying reason for that design. And then incorporated into it is the Germanic Scandinavian runes, which also represent...
I wouldn't have thought that. How does that work? That's fascinating.
What
is a rune, anyhow?
The rune was a part of their mythology, and there was there is actual representations of runes, and the one that I created for this sculpture was a bind rune, which incorporates several different aspects of rune, and in this case represents personal responsibility and courage. And personal responsibility has been an underlying theme of mine, particularly with the children, which anymore if my daughter is around, she'll say, yeah, and remember Father always talked about personal responsibility. So, but a lot of it was a celebration of nature, and where I placed it in our backyard was in a natural setting.
I see. So I noticed that the runner or the figure is on one leg. Is that part of what you saw as the sort of the exuberance of crossing the finish line? I guess that's partly the way it worked for me, the way I felt about it.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I felt that if you're going to celebrate, let's not celebrate standing flat-footed,
Well, I know that form of the upraised arms is a form that you seem to find very powerful and very meaningful. So I wonder if you could talk for a moment about a similar sculpture called We Celebrate. This sculpture, as you know, has 2 figures with the upraised arms. Give us a little insight into how you came to that.
Yeah, I see that as the love or the friendship of 2 people celebrating life in the eternal present. And again, the eternal present represents where we only exist. And there's a number of philosophers that have talked about that. But we don't exist in the past, and we don't exist in the future. We exist right now in the present. And from my perspective, that's the only place we'll ever exist.
And what do we see in this sculpture that gives us this sensation of the eternal present?
I think it's celebrating the present, celebrating life that exists right now.
Well, because when I look at both of them, what I sense is a kind of exuberance. And I don't know whether that's a word that was part of your thinking, but somehow or other, for me, that's one of the aspects of life that you seem to produce. I have to use the word that you like to celebrate.
It is, and I think if people that understand what life is about are celebrating, or hopefully celebrating, particularly if they have the love of their partner.
Well, when you talk about celebration, I find it intriguing that you talk about it in terms of an awareness of the movement of time. Could we look at your piece called Partners in the Eternal Present? One of the reasons why I have enjoyed not only your friendship but your work is because you move in a series of intellectual and emotional dimensions. And this phrase, eternal present, for me has both an intellectual and an emotional component. I don't know whether that's the way you look at it, but I want you to respond if you can. In particular, respond in terms of the form of this eternal present, where you've got the two figures and they're sort of joined at the bottom but free at the top. Could you discuss that for a moment?
Sure, and as you know, that I did that. I should have overlapped them a little bit more.
Really? Why is that?
Well, I just felt that in a true partnership there is a little more overlap, and the overlap represents love of the two partners of each other, and as you move up the sculpture, it also represents an independent relationship, that a certain degree of freedom, that each of the partners has respect for each other. This is particularly true of the male and female, or any two partners, but particularly the male and the female, where there's a mutually equal respect for one another and what their outlooks are and so on. And so that's the reason that I've created it in this sense.
Well, I find that particularly interesting for several reasons, but one reason is it's a paradox. What you've created is a physical form in which you're celebrating two different dimensions. You're celebrating the dimension of closeness and unity, but you're also celebrating the dimension of, I don't know what word you'd use, separateness.
Use independence.
Independence, the celebration of independence.
Yeah. I don't.
Was that in your mind as you were creating this piece, or was that sort of something that emerged as the piece was developed? How does that?
No, that was something. One of the things that really bothers me is a subservience in a relationship, and in this case, I specifically wanted to show that these two attributes are co-equal and are necessary for a meaningful relationship.
I see.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, relationship is something that you obviously think about, you think deeply about. So I wonder if we could move on to another piece which seems to involve the concept in a different way of relationships. It's called the family of four.
Yeah.
Could you comment a little bit about that? Because this, I presume, is a family with the two highest figures are the parents and the lower figures are the children. How did you come to conceive of that and execute that?
Yeah, this particular sculpture is about a little over 5 feet tall, and it represents our second son's family. And the idea here is that the silver ring about halfway down the sculpture ties them together emotionally and physically. the outward facing figures represents their personal responsibility, and they're looking into the future as to what they're going to do individually. And there's that tie between the two. You know, where do we cut the umbilical cord? And hopefully, my son and daughter-in-law have done that with their two children.
So again, you seem to like to celebrate what I would call paradox. They're tied together, but they're also free to move out on their own lives, their own dimension. Is that partly what you're...
Yeah, that's true. But one of the things is that I see so many of the parents, as they fail to cut the umbilical cord to give their children that freedom to move out on their own. Some do it better than others, obviously, but that's that. If there is such a thing as a paradox, that would be a paradox in this case. Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons why I think art can be so powerful is that the physical art form, the work of art itself, if we're attending to it, can manifest and allow us in a variety of emotional ways as well as intellectual ways to experience contradiction, paradox, whatever.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I like abstract art rather than representational. And they both have their advantages and disadvantages, but to me the abstract art allows the viewer to embed their own biases and insights and creativity into the work, rather than a strictly representational piece that perhaps is pretty well defined by the work itself.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that. Maybe we could turn our attention to a piece that looks to me to be fairly explicit, but at the same time, whenever I look at it, I get that sensation of abstraction. That's called, I'm not sure of the correct pronunciation, Manskin Moonlight?
Right, Manskin. I've become fairly proficient in the Scandinavian, the Danish and Norwegian language. Manskin, or Moonlight, we were visiting Norway and some of our relatives, and I went to this one art studio and I saw a sketch that was not exactly like I've crafted a sculpture, but it showed the different aspects of the moon. And the other thing that was really interesting is that a lot of cultures, but also the Scandinavian culture, Monday or Mandag in Norse is Moon Day or Moonlight Day, and so it from a science perspective, as we all know now, the moon was very, very close to the Earth at one time, and has moved away to a point that we now can have an eclipse. The other thing that's important about the moon is that it helps stabilize the Earth, and so there's just a number of things why I was interested in Manskin.
Well, how does that stabilization and relationship manifest? Because here you have this beautiful silvery luminescent ball on one side, and then the darker shapes on the other side.
Well, that's a good point. I had never thought about that, Ron.
Well, it may be that my assumption is that partly what you're doing is intuitive, which is entirely powerful and appropriate. But so I'm asking you maybe to sort of crawl back into your intuitive perspective, and you might not want to do that.
I may not want to crawl back.
You might not want to crawl back. But your work seems so intellectual in some senses, and that's so sort of almost mystical in other senses.
Well, a part of it has to do, with the Greeks too. They were very.
So this is not only Scandinavian in impulse, but also Greek.
Yeah, because of their attitude about the planets and the moon, and but it primarily came out of the Scandinavian, the graphic that I saw in Scandinavia.
Yes. Well, let's see if we can move on in another direction because there's so much to talk about in so little time. You have a piece called The Direction of Time, and time is clearly a significant part of your thought process, it's part of your sense of what's happening in life. Could you talk for a moment about this piece, The Direction of Time?
Yeah.
The very word direction I find provocative.
Yeah. I'm really mesmerized, and there's a number of great thinkers, Aristotle and of course Einstein in relativity and Newton with the more absolute time. And our little lizard friend that I put on the sculpture piece actually he's probably an ancestor, was scratching its head and saying, what's going on? What's this deal about time?
Yes.
And if you look at some of the different philosophers and scientists, and quantum mechanics, for example, there's time is potentially reversible from a quantum perspective.
Okay, you're creating this sculptural piece, but part of the creative process is you're processing these ideas about time and the different ways in which it can be conceived.
Right. The arrows on there represent 5 different aspects of time. One of them is psychological, another one's relative, another one is entropy or enlightenment. And so different philosophers and scientists have come up with at least 5 different types of time. And so that's what those arrows represent.
Well, it strikes me that your work is particularly adventurous in that it merges into theoretical postures in modern science, particularly in physics. And I have always felt that your work is quite diverse. As an example, is your willingness to do something that most artists wouldn't do, make a comment, a physical comment with a work of art on the work of another artist. There's this piece that you have called Flight. Do you remember? Obviously, you remember making it, but I'm wondering if you remember conceiving of it. It's partly related to Brancusi's famous piece, Bird in Space.
Right. Yeah.
I thought it was quite adventurous of you to make a work of art that's a comment on another artist's work.
Yeah, Brancusi was a Romanian sculptor. He had several very large pieces, but was very famous for his flight, Bird in Flight, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I saw that, and I crafted one with different materials than he used. But the thing that I moved towards was it wasn't necessarily the wing of a bird, it was a feather.
And that physical distinction is also an intellectual distinction?
It was, because I saw it as a quill, and a quill is used, in my mind, metaphorically, as a flight of imagination when you're writing.
It's a writing instrument which allows the imagination to soar.
Yes. And so there was that relationship between the feather or the wing, but particularly the feather and the flight of imagination that we have when we use it as a quill.
Well, I thought it was particularly adventurous of you to take a piece that was that famous and render your own definition. So I say bravo.
Well, Brancusi may be looking down on me and saying,
Yeah,
you
you
plagiarized my work.
Well, I don't see it that way. I see it as sort of a delightful innovation. Let me move on to another delightful innovation. You have a piece that I find a lot of your work utterly fascinating, which is called Ego Bound. And so I'm looking at the piece, which is pieces of metal, pieces, some of which are pieces of metal that you got from the farm.
Right, yeah, and it's right, this is
Oh,
the
here
piece.
it is.
This is the piece right here.
I love this piece. Talk about taking this materials from everyday life, if you will,
Yeah.
and how everyday life in a physical object could be transformed into a philosophical and visual experience and expression.
I've talked just a little bit about the ego-bound concept. I like to cause myself to look in the mirror periodically to challenge my own pet theories and try to wound them if necessary. But I see I am also captured as the ball represents, in this case, as the ego, the outside rings which came off of a Conestoga
Now, is
wagon.
the outside ring, is that the ego structure?
This is the fused part. This is what maybe my great-grandfather, blacksmith, actually fused this form for
And
a
it is-
Conestoga
it is
wagon.
This physical part of the piece that represents the ego boundary, the ego.
The boundaries of the ego,
and
or
the-
how
and
we've
the
established.
constriction, the constricting aspect of the ego.
Right, and the ball represents our ego, and it's, in my mind, it's up to us to be able to move outside. And we'll see on one of the other sculptures how we potentially can move outside. The other thing this particular sculpture represents is the earth as seen particularly by the church as the center of the universe. And of course we know that Copernicus and Galileo later challenged that and said that probably we're not the center of the universe. And obviously
We're not even the center of the solar system.
yeah, and perhaps then the Enlightenment had an opportunity to surface. Yeah, but this is the rings were some of the material we took from our farm up in Montana.
Well, I wonder if you would comment on that for a moment. The idea that one could create meaningful artistic pieces, meaningful sculptural pieces, from everyday functional commercial pieces of material. How did you make that transition? Because it strikes to me that took a little bit of imagination, more than a little bit, a significant amount of imagination, to conceive of using these functional commercial instruments in a profoundly artistic manner.
Yeah,
Did you think of it in that way, or did you just sort of move unconsciously and spontaneously into it?
probably unconsciously is probably the operative word. But yeah, we had so much material up there. There was several old Conestoga wagons. The wood had rotted away, and so the rings that held the hubs together were there on the ground, and along with buck rake tines.
So we're talking about an object that's over 100 years old.
Yeah, I would say these were probably in the late 1800s.
Yes.
These rings.
140 years old.
Yeah, and a lot of the material was around the turn of the century that I had acquired and set aside over the years. Yeah, but
Well, that's fascinating, particularly when you consider that you're juxtaposing these ancient, if you will, objects with modern ideas from modern physics. Speaking of modern physics, let me ask you about the piece that you call Our Center. How did you come up with that particular title? Because I can see the title in the work.
yeah, this by the way, this was a gift that I gave to Ron on his 80th birthday, and
When I was younger.
yeah, right. This is what 20 years ago when you were
Right.
younger, but. One of the things that was interesting to me about this, again, it goes back to the ego again to some extent, where we operate in the field of time, but we also have a boundary that we form individually.
Okay, and for you, the ego is a very real human phenomenon.
It is.
This is a dominant reality.
It is, and we get caught up, and the psychologists would talk about it, the cognitive biases that we create for ourselves, which forms and shapes this boundary. And what I'm arguing in this particular sculpture is that occasionally we have to move outside the field of time and examine our biases, our creativity, and also our gratitude.
Another piece that you have, which I find, when I look at it, quite puzzling. Interesting, but quite puzzling. I'm looking at it, and that's the piece called the Ninth Dimension, Midgard. And when I look at it, what I see is a six-pointed object. But when I looked at your description of it, it's actually an object that has 9 major dimensions or facets rather than 6. Could you talk about the 6-pointed object, which is the overlapping triangles, and then tell us a little bit about the movement or the inclusion of the other 3 dimensions or aspects?
Yeah, some of the dimensions are very straightforward, and we can see them in various aspects of physics, and even in Euclid's geometry, looking at 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and so on, 4 dimensions with Einstein. But this comes out of an
So
early...
when we talk about dimensions initially, we're talking about the physical properties of the universe.
Right. And as we move up in the dimensions, they become more cerebral. What the title of this comes out of the cosmic period and of the Scandinavians, and
What was the date of that?
this would have been in that 400, 500, 600 AD.
AD.
Yeah. And one of the things that Midgard means Middle Earth in Norwegian, in Scandinavian.
And is that a celestial or metaphysical territory? Middle Earth?
No, that is not. It means Midgard is Middle Earth.
Literally Middle
Yeah.
Earth.
And the underlying concept of Midgard is that we experience the other 8 dimensions on Earth and not some ethereal place. And that's what resonated to me. And it gets back to existing in the present. We experience the present right now, and where do we experience it? We experience it here on Earth, and not in some foreign place. And that's one of the reasons that I put this together.
Well, this is clearly, in your mind, a significant understanding. Is there anything in this sculptural piece that explains how one can move to that kind of understanding? What did the Norwegians have to say?
Well, they move through these other 8 dimensions until you.
How? How do you do that? Does this tell?
From the reading that I've done, I have not seen them. The only thing you can sense in their philosophy is that it's an evolutionary process. It's not unlike yoga, the Kundalini, or one of the other yogas, is that you move up through the different stages.
One of the reasons why I'm questioning you closely about this is because part of the power of sculptural pieces, and art in general, is that ideas, concepts, perceptions can be generated on a subtle level. They're present, but there's a subtlety about it because of the form in which they come. And so that's what I was asking you to.
Yeah, it's just outside my wavelength right now, Ron. In terms, I've read and I've studied it, but how those transitions are actually made is, I would have to fall back and say they're more evolutionary and very similar to yoga.
So when I look at this piece, I get this powerful reaction. I get this this perception that the piece is somehow or other generating a message.
Well, there's an
speaking to
eye
me.
there that's looking at you.
That's probably it. Yes. And when you put the eye in, that was very intentional.
Oh, it was, yeah. 'Cause, I wanted to keep an eye on you.
Oh, keep an eye on this
Yeah.
rascal who lives down the street. Fascinating. Well, let's see if we can move on to something that is perhaps equally fascinating, but coming from a dramatically different culture. Here, the ninth dimension we have from the Norwegian, Scandinavian,
In Germanic, yeah.
Germanic culture, but you have a piece that comes from a completely different sculpture, the seven chakras coming from the Hindu the Hindu tradition. What attracted you to that tradition and to that particular conceptual understanding emanating out of the Hindu tradition?
Well, the Kundalini Yoga has 7 chakras, and some of the lower chakras.
And tell us what a chakra is.
Well, a chakra represents a particular aspect of our being. It could be very basic.
But this is a manifestation of a physical human capacity.
Right.
Human beings have these 7 chakras, each of which generates or offers different kinds of energy, intelligence, possibilities.
Right.
What?
I wouldn't say that any individual has the 7 chakras. I would say that individuals have the opportunity to move up to these various chakras.
And each chakra offers different possibilities?
Each chakra represents a different aspect of our evolution as you approach non-duality and also pure consciousness. Most of us are still laying down towards the bottom, which represents, well, at its very basic, sex and food and gratification. It isn't until you reach the upper chakras that you really start, in my mind, experiencing life.
You use the word non-duality. When I look at this sculptural piece, what am I seeing in that object that is suggestive of non-duality?
Non-duality is a move away from, well, obviously from duality, where you have an expression of essentially 2 sides, and all of a sudden.
Is that an expression of separation?
A separation in the sense that we've created the separation by defining as 2 objects rather than on a continuum. I see non-duality as things existing on a continuum rather than as a specific duality.
And the balls that are going upward and getting bigger in size as they go upward represent that continuum.
Well, from a Kundalini Yoga perspective, it represents an improvement in one's thinking. Now, I don't think I've ever reached pure consciousness, and I don't know that I ever will, but apparently some have.
And when I look at this sculptural piece, if I'm understanding, if I'm getting at least part of what you are offering, it would be this understanding of non-duality.
Non-duality, and if you can reach pure consciousness, a celebration again of reaching pure consciousness.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about something that strikes me as quite powerfully similar. You've got a piece called The Eye of Imagination, Curiosity and Creativity. How did you come to that?
I've again
Object.
been mesmerized.
Is that related to the previous piece?
No, not really. I mean, there may be some relationship, but one of the things that I've again been really mesmerized by a long time is how the retina can take wavelengths, process it to the visual cortex, and somehow or other we can see. because the various items they have wavelengths that can be translated into different colors.
And different meanings. No? Don't let me put words into your mouth.
Yeah, the meanings in my mind are somehow or other constructed in our brain.
Well, the reason why I say meanings is because the wavelengths that are coming through are certain physical realities, but as they come through the organism, they get translated, if you will. They get and come finally into the neurological field, and we come out with a certain reduced and specific interpretation.
Yeah, to me, I mean, scientists and various other disciplines have struggled with how this works. You know, there's many people working on this right now. But again, what really was interesting to me was that somehow or other we can take wavelengths through our retina and into our visual cortex, and somehow the brain works its magic, and we can not only see it, but most of us can see it in color.
So this sculptural piece that you created offers the viewer the eye, which is the receptive object, but also there's this, I don't know what you would call this shape that the eye rests in. How did you decide on that particular shape?
I saw of course the center is the retina.
Yes.
And the rest of it is the object that the retina is included in. It includes the eye itself.
So this shape is roughly the shape of the human eye.
Human eye.
The larger.
Right.
The lidded eye, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is the object that we use to interface. We interface with the world in a number of ways, but very profoundly we're interfacing with the eye. And you're suggesting the eye is capable of an outer, obvious kind of receptivity, but also a more sophisticated kind of receptivity.
Right, and I think a lot of people think that the seeing appears or is a part of the retina, and it really isn't. It's only a receptor. I mean, it's a sophisticated receptor, but it then translates to the visual cortex that works its magic somehow or other, in the brain.
And that's partly what you want the viewer of this piece to be thinking about, to be feeling, to perceive, to be perceiving.
Right. Yeah.
This sort of creative use of the material, the energy that comes through the eye.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that sounds utterly scientific in a certain sense and utterly metaphysical in another sense. Speaking of scientific and metaphysical, let's look at one interesting object which you call entanglement. Could you talk for a moment about what moved you to create this piece?
Well, I've been really fascinated. I've audited a number of courses in quantum physics, and one of the things that the quantum field has basically shown and proved is that two electrons can communicate with each other over vast differences. Some of them would say infinite different distances, with no time involved between, and which is clearly when we transmit something from the moon, it takes X number of time units to reach us.
Yes.
Well, quantum physics has demonstrated that these electrons can communicate with no time between them.
Why is that important?
Well, it's important because it's so different from other aspects of physics, and it's very difficult for us to understand.
Well, it suggests the need for another model.
Well, that's what we have in quantum physics, is another model. And the materials that I used in this particular sculpture were buckrake tines and the steel covering that goes around a buckrake. And I've incorporated more than just 2 electrons. I've got 4 electrons there with the buckrake tines. And
they're communicating timelessly to one another, with one another?
Right. And this is outside. It's about 5 feet tall. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is, in order to emphasize the entanglement, my good partner has planted a plant that winds its way up into the buckrake tines and emphasizes the entanglement. So, you know, again, it's a play on words.
We've got entanglement on top of entanglement.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is, in some marvelous way, symbolic in my mind of art in its best sense of the term. Art in the best sense of the term entangles us in a variety of dimensions of insight, perception, and meaning. Let's talk about a couple of more things here. One is another type of sculpture which is suggestive of insight and of ways of moving toward insights, and it's called the key. And when I look at it, I'm quite intrigued because it's clearly something, a found object which you adjusted in your own creative way into a significant sculptural piece. How on earth did you find this, and how on earth did you translate it into this key, which is about, to quote you, the metaphorical door of the mind?
Yeah, these particular hinges were on.
Oh, here it is.
They were on the door of one of our homes in Montana, and the pins became so worn that the door wasn't stable, so I took them off. And the house was built about 1910, and so I saved those hinges all this time, and
So
and
it's
also
like saving history. You save the history a little bit.
right, yeah, and I had them in a box, and I got to thinking that I also had the key, and I had the key entrance, and I've been thinking for a long time about the metaphor of using the key to open the metaphorical door of our mind, and then exploring our biases again, and some of my same old, but looking at the biases, the creativity, and then the other thing that I think is so important when we open our mind is gratitude towards others, and the gratitude towards Mother Earth for the life that we have.
So this theme that you have of the open mind is in some ways a very broad, very powerful idea.
For me it is,
Yes.
yeah, and that's what this represents. The hinges, I love the hinges, the way they were developed, and whoever the craftsperson was that developed these hinges.
Right, the hinges remind me of a book opening. I don't know why, but that's something that I jumped to. But basically, the hinges represent the capacity for openness, which I think is a very powerful use. It's a powerful example of sculptural potential. So it's a small piece, much smaller than most of your pieces, but not small in terms of its implications.
Yeah, it's a theme that resonates through a lot of my sculptures, but the need for us to metaphorically and hopefully, from an actual sense, open our mind up and explore some of our biases and our creativity.
Well, let's finish our conversation with one final beautiful piece, the drokken. My sense is that you are clearly mindful of your genealogical past, and this is part of that mindfulness. Tell us how you came to appreciate that and become interested in exploring that a little bit, because I get the impression that this ship represents that awareness.
Yeah, the drokken is a Scandinavian term, and the Danish and the Swedes and have something very, very similar, and it actually stands for dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And
the dragon was part of the mythology, I'm presuming.
It is. It comes out of a whole series of Odin and Thor, particularly some of the Scandinavian gods or leaders.
But why is that meaningful to you in the 21st century?
Well, of course, the drokken is significant to me because that was the skip or the ship of my 32nd grandfather.
Ah.
And
so there's this genealogical connection.
Yeah, there's a genealogical connection. He was and when I say my 32nd grandfather, you know, he had 5 or 6 wives, so there are all kinds of relatives involved, and I'm just one of many. But he was the first king of United Norway. He united the various other leaders of Norway into a single nation.
Uh-huh.
And so, you know, that
this
was
is 500 AD, about 550.
No, it was later than that. It was in that late 1800s and early 900s.
Oh, okay.
Is when I think he was born in I'm going to say 830. Is that right? Maybe a little bit earlier than that. But yeah, he was, and it's Harald the Fair Hair,
Uh-huh.
and that has its own set of interesting things which we won't bore people with now. But yeah, he was a real dominant figure in Norwegian history.
Well, it's a beautiful piece, and I can imagine how suggestive it is of a whole range of historical facts and stories that we don't have time to talk about now, but which are certainly worth learning about and pursuing.
Yeah. Well, the Vikings used this form of skip or ship for a lot of the things that they were famous or infamous for in England and down the coast.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting vehicle that they used in their various plundering and so on. Well, and also some of the activities they later had in England and Ireland.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Thanks so much for your time. It was marvelous transitioning
and thanks to
traveling
you, Ron.
over your creative
One thing
career.
that we might mention is that the Atlas engineering program at CU has published the first 40 sculptures that I did, and they're available on blurb.com if anybody would care to take a look. You not only can look at you can actually go in and look at the book and online and go through the narrative. One of the points that you raised, Ron, is that I've written a comment on in some case fairly extensive comment on each of the sculptors, but they're not with the sculpture picture. They're in the back of the book. So if somebody is interested, they can go back and see what my comments were. But my intent with putting them in a separate section of the book was so that they didn't influence the individual's own interpretation.
Which I think is a marvelous way of doing it.
Yeah.
So the viewer can have their initial impression, and then if they choose, they can have the delight of your additional insights and guidance and interpretation.
And what inspired me to do it, and it's purely voluntary. They can look at it or not.
Yeah.
But anyway,
so much.
Thanks so much for your help in this. Thanks a lot for coming by and sharing some of my sculptures with me. I really appreciate that. You have a good day.